Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mamluks podcast. My name is Sim. Along with me is my co-host Mort. Sheikh Amr Saeed, His Holiness, is not with us today. He's attending a family matter, I think, if I understand correctly. Mort, assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to have you. You are here visiting from Buffalo, New York.
It's correct. Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
What's the situation in Buffalo? Is the streets burnt down? The store's still intact? What's going on?
It's chill. I mean, yeah.
We heard some news out of Buffalo about some police officer killing some guy.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, Buffalo's been pretty good, though. I mean, there's some looting here and there, but, you know, the Yemenis hold it down, so they had their guns out.
I heard about that.
Sure,
I saw the Yemenis taking...
There's like 3 blocks from me, like they were calling on the phone, hey, come over to the mahal. I said, okay, all right, we'll come there. And like, these Yemenis are running around shooting guns off. But it was funny, though. I mean, but it was funny because the people who you think were protesting or looting are actually not the ones who are looting.
Yeah.
Like they tried to push a certain narrative and come to find out it's actually not the protesters that are looting. So that was kind of cool to see. I mean, different to find out. But other than that, alhamdulillah, I mean, a day or two it was kind of rough. I mean, people had to watch out. They started boarding up some things. But other than that, I mean, it's pretty calm.
Cool. Well, audience, make sure to help us out on patreon.com/themadmamluks. This effort would not be possible without your support. Your support directly contributes to the upkeep of this show. This show had to move studios a few months back, and it was because of your funds we were able to build a washroom down here. We were able to relocate to the studio, to our new studio, and things got back up very, very, very quickly because of your funds. And we're not asking for $100. We want those hundreds of dollars sent for good causes, relief efforts and whatnot. We're just asking for a few bucks a month and help us out in whatever way you can. There's not a whole lot of Muslim content, especially at the type of content we deliver. We don't deliver, Christian versus atheist part 11. The revenge. This is some academic types, and we have some wonderful guests for you that no other platform can bring. Dr. Ali Harfouch from Lebanon. Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, but wa alaikum salam, but I am not a doctor.
Aren't you your PhD? Just nod your head and say yeah. Just make it look good for the camera.
Yeah, I'm not a doctor yet. Just clarification.
I'm joking. I know you weren't. I just wanted to make you feel weird.
Oh, thank you. That was a very good
These guys know I do that all the time. Yeah. Don't worry about it.
A very good way of starting off the conversation.
We just wanted to see if you were honest or not. That's why.
The litmus test, the initial litmus test.
Yeah.
Ali was the first guest who was supposed to be on the show when we went to video. More, I don't know if you remember, but we had everything set up, and I told Ali, Ali, I'm not sure how this is gonna go, but it might be a flop or not. And then we eventually had to go audio only because I had all the cameras misconfigured. It was funny, but I was worried. I'm like, oh man, I hope he doesn't take it as a slight.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
Ali, what brings you to town? You came at a tumultuous period of American history all the way from Lebanon.
Actually, bro, that's actually a very funny question because, so I was in Beirut, and while I was in Beirut, a revolution erupted. And I mean revolution, like rioting, you had the tear gas, the crackdown, water cannons, you name it. And then the COVID pandemic happened. So at one point they were about to close the airports, and I realized, okay, I should take this as an opportunity to go somewhere where I can come and focus on my PhD applications and on my writings and whatnot. So I decided to come to the United States, and as soon as I arrived in the United States, I get news that New York, because I arrived in New York, that New York just hit its peak with COVID. So I went from one lockdown to another. And then a few weeks later, we have the rebellions in the United States. So it's been a very interesting transition.
Are you a U.S. citizen?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, born and raised.
Welcome back.
Yeah, because when you said like, I decided to relocate to America, I was like, well, oh, maybe he's not a citizen. I didn't know, but that's good. Okay, so it must have been easy for you. No, because I know they were like preventing certain people,
like refugees,
from coming back into from coming to the country.
They don't like them here anymore. Refugees.
Yeah. Well, apparently, even if you were on a green card or whatever, like they were even if you had H-1B visas, they were pushing you away during the COVID stuff.
Yeah.
Like only citizens could come in. So that's why I was kind of wondering.
That's Abu Ivanka. He doesn't like this stuff.
Abu Ivanka, yeah, I know.
Abu Ivanka.
Yeah, that's my nickname for him. Oh, well, that's good though. That's good. So now you're back in. So you flew into LaGuardia or JFK?
JFK.
And then so now right now you are in Jersey or New York City?
New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
I split my time between Jersey and New York, basically.
Okay. Well, very good. Very good. Yeah, I'm usually up in Buffalo, New York, so I'm not like about 6 hours from there, but I come down to New York City because I have family that lives in Queens and Long Island. So yeah.
Mashallah, Ali is waste no time. As soon as he got here, he started preparing for a lecture. He smelled revolution in the air, and he said, "You know what? It's time for a nice lecture series to propagate among the Muslims." And he started working on what. And Ali, why don't you just explain to the listener what exactly your paper is about?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this part of a much larger project that I call the New Medina Project. And what it is essentially is trying to go back to our sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, and go back to our Islamic tradition, the Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, and some of the contemporary scholars, to articulate or to try to develop some kind of philosophy for liberation, some kind of Islamic liberation theology. And at one point, when while doing the research, I realized that part of this project was inescapably, going back to our aqidah, going back to the concept of tawheed. And the concept of tawheed, not as it was articulated, in like ilm al-kalam, like the division between the Ash'ari and the Mu'tazila, but the aqidah as it was articulated and as it was being revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a philosophy for liberation, right? As this like very dynamic, active set of ideas that completely ruptured modern day Mecca at that time. So the idea is, inshallah, like given that now as Muslims we live in this age of protest and this age of change, and we're constantly trying to find our place, between the left, between the right, the conservatives, the leftists, and all these questions about alliances with the LGBTQ versus alliances with the conservative community, and so forth. I think in light of all that, I said, okay, what we really need is to ground our project as Muslims, to ground our vision as Muslims in our own aqidah, into our own metaphysics. So that's basically what the project is about, inshallah. It's the objective is to, one, ground our identity in what is our first commitment, which is La ilaha illallah, but also to show that Tawheed, Aqidah, and La ilaha illallah is not a science. It's not a subject matter that you just study in the books. It is a lens through which you see the world. It is a lens through which you transform and engage with the world, right? And Islam is simply the externalization, the manifestation of that liberating metaphysics, that liberating aqidah. So I think when Muslims, the whole idea is that when Muslims come to understand just how the emancipatory potential of our aqidah, then this will empower them and enable them to engage in more positive and future-oriented political projects rather than these ad hoc, establishment-based, reactionary politics that we have now, especially among Muslims in the United States.
So you would say this is, correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, but a lot of these ad hoc groups, like these are social justice groups that are coming about, and a lot of times people mean well, but they don't have. There's no Islamic foundation around or at the core of these movements. So is your project trying to give the community people who wish to be involved in activism a movement that's grounded within the principles of Islam? Is that what we're trying to move away from? Like, meaning that instead of just being BLM or or pro immigration or whatever it may be, right? Pro rights, or it's about, okay, well, we can argue for these things on from a platform that is representative of our core values.
100%. The problem, in the absence of a philosophy, in the absence of our own first commitments, and by which I mean an aqidah, we're always going to be on the margins, okay? As the Muslim community in the United States, or as a Muslim ummah globally, we are always going to be on the margins. And in the absence of our own commitments and foundations, then it's naturally that we will be absorbed by different groups and take up ad hoc projects with relation to, for example, political rights when it comes to transgender movements, immigration, CVE, American foreign policy, American domestic policy, all of these things. The only way for us to emerge from the margins into the center, to actually have a voice in domestic politics and in global politics, is if we have those autonomous, independent first commitments that essentially define what we are, not just as a community, but as a movement. Mm-hmm. Muslims as being part of a movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just a quick follow-up. So you just mentioned things like keywords like aqidah and siyasa, like politics. So what's the relationship between, for a Muslim, like as us today, the relationship between aqidah and like politics or siyasa? Like how do you rectify these two?
That's an excellent question. See, one of the reasons there's been so much confusion on answering that question is because we've inherited a language, an Anglo-European language, that creates blind spots. Okay, so for example, one of the words we've inherited is the word religion, right? And another word is the word politics, right? And so what we've done is, whether consciously or subconsciously, is that we've tried to fit Islam into these kind of like conceptual categories, right? Into these filing cabinets. And that is why we find it difficult to link Islam to politics, right? But when we reclaim our own discourse, right? And by that, I mean the Quranic discourse, the Quranic semantic vocabulary. What we find is that there is an inextricable link between politics and Islam. As a matter of fact, that the very word deen, for example, in Islam, generally in today, the word deen is translated into religion, which is actually a mistake, because the word deen, and we say Islam is a deen, the word deen is actually synonymous in the Arabic lexicon with siyasa. It's literally synonymous with the word politics, right? Because it entails a sort of submission, it entails a sort of obedience to some kind of authority. So politics has always been integral to Islam. The relationship has been mystified only when we have not been able to think on our own terms, right? When we appropriate a vocabulary and concepts that are not of our own making, mm-hmm. primarily secular vocabulary. Now, with regards to in Islam, the relationship between politics and aqidah, first let me clarify what's the relation. Before I talk about the relationship between aqidah, Islamic aqidah, and Islamic politics, from a broader perspective, what is the relationship between any politics, any political system, and aqidah, right? Because we know there's different aqa'id, there are different worldviews out there. You have the liberal worldview, you have the Marxist worldview, you have a Lockean liberal worldview, and so forth. So what's the relationship between their worldviews and their politics? If you look into any political system, for example, the Federal Republic in the United States, okay, or the idea of the libertarian state or the socialist state, you'll find that any political state, any set of political institutions is grounded in an aqidah, institutions and politics are merely the manifestation of a certain set of aqaidi principles, which are essentially what is the concept of man, what is human nature, what is the absolute, right? What is the ultimate concern of man, what is God, and the relationship between God and man. So even secular systems, right? Secular systems have had to deal with these questions inevitably, right? They had to first flesh out their own aqidah, their own metaphysics, and then build the institutions based on which the institutions that materialize from those concepts, right? Now in Islam, the Prophet ﷺ in the Meccan phase, right, was laying out that aqidah. He was laying out the metaphysics for the politics, the political institutions that would come later on in Medina, while also engaging in political struggle himself.
Can you give an example of that? Like how he was, just so that.
Of course. So, for example, and this is something we discussed in the class, in the course, in the Meccan Quran. Okay, one of the most fundamental concepts that were introduced was the absolute transcendence of Allah Azza wa Jal, right, and the createdness of man. In other words, the Islamic Aqidah inaugurated the shift from Allah as being the higher God, from being a higher God among many, to Allah being the one God. And then the Quran went even further and it said, look, not only is Allah the creator, but Allah is also the sovereign, meaning that Allah has cosmic sovereignty in his capacity to create, but Allah also possesses temporal sovereignty, legal sovereignty. And this was the concept of al-hukm. So there's actually a brilliant piece by Wa al-Hallaq, where even in the Meccan phase, the Prophet was laying out the concepts that would form the structures, the political structures of Islam to come, which was one, the sovereignty of the Quran, and two, the obligation of obeying the injunctions of the Quran, basically. And that, by which I mean that lawmaking occurred through the apparatus of ijtihad and not through some kind of parliamentary apparatus or pure reason, as Kant would have put it, or general will, as Rousseau would have put it. So the very fact that the Prophet was laying down these radical principles in Mecca, right, was in and of itself a major political event. It was a major political rupture with the prevailing systems at the time.
I just want to interject for a second. Was that understood by the prevailing power structures at that time? Did the Meccan Jahili Meccan society know that, hey, wait a second, he's not just talking about being a prophet here. He's talking about implementing a new form of society, a new form of governance. Was that understood, or was that like kind of up in the air?
100%. As a matter of fact, very early into the Seerah, very early into the Meccan phase, one of the Arab Bedouins comes to the Prophet. He was named Harith al-Shaybani. And he had heard about all the controversy, and he heard that there was some guy who was causing fitna and causing an uproar in Mecca. So he goes to Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. He says, "Oh Muhammad, what is it that you are calling the people towards?" So the Prophet replies, "I am calling them to La ilaha illallah." And so Harith Shaybani responds by saying, and I believe this is in Musnad Imam Ahmad, he says, "Oh Muhammad, this is a statement which the kings will not accept." This is a statement which the kings will not accept. Because essentially what the Prophet ﷺ was introducing was a set of concepts and ideas that fundamentally altered the existing relationships between man and man and God. The sources of legitimacy, the sources of power. and essentially attacking the tradition that justified the sovereignty and the domination of the hegemony of the Quraysh elite at that time. And that's precisely why they waged different kinds of wars against the Prophet, whether it's an economic boycott, whether it's a smear campaign, whether it's torture, whether it's attempts at exile. This all occurred in the Meccan phase, and there was no armed struggle. It was purely a reaction to the Prophet's ideas, the liberatory ideas that the Prophet was introducing at that time. And to appreciate this even more, if you look at, to see just how transformative and revolutionary these concepts are, when you compare the Quran and some of the key political concepts in the Quran, such as kufr, iman, taghut, takabbur, al-hukum, al-amr, and so forth, right? When you compare these words to the way that they were being used in pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah, you will find that the Quran fundamentally restructured even the language that Quraysh spoke. Right? So the Prophet was not just introducing a new philosophy, he was introducing a new language. Right? So it was a rupture at all levels. Right? It was a rupture at all levels with the Meccan society at that time. And that's precisely what made the Prophet so dangerous for Quraysh, because he refused to speak their language, he refused to speak on their terms, right? And he refused to accept accept any of the existing, let's say, Jahili principles as being some kind of mediation or being some kind of transitionary phase, transitionary segue into Islam. It was a radical break. It was a radical rupture. And what exemplifies this the most is that there's two surahs in the Quran that we don't really understand properly, because we think that they are just like philosophical and purely related to God. Surah Al-Ikhlas, قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. This is a direct attack on the aqidah of the aqaid and the demigods of Mecca at that time. But Allah did not stop there, right? Then Surah Al-Kafirun was revealed. Surah Al-Kafirun, which demarcated at that time the believers from the non-believers, right? Which kind of drew that bold red line between Iman and Kufr. And this is where the struggle began. This is where the clash began, right? Because it was essentially a struggle for power.
Yeah, so let me so the way I understand this is that when Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came, he presented something that was radically different politically from what Quraysh had already implemented, and it was what was part of their existing structure, right? So let me just play devil's advocate here for a second. So let's say someone, like all of us are living in America, or maybe some other people are living in a different part of the world, and they hear this and they say, well, you see, like, Islam is politics. Like, they just simply want to radically change what we have right now is currently in our system of governance and politically. And for a long time, I know, for whatever reasons, Muslims have been saying, well, we separate politics from the religion. We're not really going to get involved with the politics. We simply just want to live our lives. So what do you say in response to somebody who says, well, you see, this is the proof that Muslims can't live among non-Muslims without causing a ruckus, like without causing a riot among them, right? Because their primary example, the source, came exactly to do that and intended to do that. So what would you respond to someone who would make this argument to you and say, well, you see, basically that Muslims living among us are...
A fifth column.
Yeah, it's incompatible. You can't allow them to live among you because they don't want to exist. They want to eventually change.
Okay, so I think the problem with that fear, is that it's based on a set of assumptions, okay, about politics, the nature of politics, right? So in an age of secular politics, in an age of politics that is based on domination and capital and militarized police and the hegemony of corporations over political affairs and whatnot, it's only natural that people would have this type of fear, right? But what Islam offers is an alternative mode of politics, a communal mode of politics that does not fetishize power, but rather ascribes power and gives sovereignty to the rule of law, which is the Sharia. And who determines the injunctions of the Sharia? It is a communal-based creative process, right? So even if you go back to the definitions of politics in amongst Muslim fuqaha, and then you compare it, for example, to the politics of John Locke or Hamilton or Marx and so forth, you'll find that it's two radically different conceptions of politics, right? One is based on power, purely based on raw power and power politics and interest and capital and legitimate violence and so forth. Whereas the Islamic conception of politics, it was literally defined by the ulama as that which brings the people towards the masalih and deters the mafasid, right? Repels the good. So I think part of our objective as a Muslim community is to explain that because our politics emanates from foundations that are different than the secular foundations that currently prevail, similarly, our politics is different than the prevailing politics. The vision and the ethos that pervades our politics is different than that of the neoliberal capitalism and Pax Americana and so forth.
So basically, in order to address the argument, you'd have to then, in theory, just redefine these definitions like politics and governance, in order to help them understand that when we say politics, we don't mean the same thing that you're talking about. We don't mean the same power struggles, the power structures and the interest that a state would have. We'd have to first define that. So basically, if someone was listening to this podcast, they shouldn't go out and just put this on the table without first defining what these terms mean from a Shari'i perspective.
Exactly. That's what I was discussing earlier, that any political system, its structure, its objectives, its goals, its limits are predefined by the aqidah from which it emanates. That's why, for example, a socialist politics is different than, Lockean liberal politics, because they emanate from two different worldviews. So the very definition of politics depends, on certain fundamental questions such as what is human nature, right? So, for example, Islam has a certain concept of man, right? Islam has a certain proposition as to what is human nature. So it's only natural that we would have a different type of political system. Islam has a different type of proposition when it comes to man-God relations. Therefore, the concept of state in Islam would be different than that of, let's say, the left or the conservative right and so forth. Now, there's something important here to point out, that when we talk about politics, we're not just talking about what governments do, right? We're not just talking about the state, the political state. That's part of it. But politics is also the active engagement with the existing, right? The average engagement or critique of the existing establishment, right? Or the existing issues or public affairs. So when the Prophet ﷺ was dealing with issues such as women's rights and infanticide, and slavery at the time of Mecca, this was politics. He was taking up political issues of the time, right? When the Prophet ﷺ, when the verses in the Quran were being revealed, the verses that we recite as children, the verses about Abu Jahl, the verses about Walid al-Mughira, the verses about Abu Lahab, etc. This was the Prophet ﷺ, prior to establishing his Islamic State, attacking the political elite in Mecca, right? Directly attacking the political elite in Mecca in a direct confrontation and in a direct struggle. So when we talk about politics for Muslims in America, we're not talking about the establishment of a state. We're talking about the active engagement in political critique and resistance to establishments that are despotic, that are oppressive, that give priority to capital over life, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And we have a role in this. We have a role in this precisely because our aqeedah demands this of us. Now, earlier we talked about some of the concepts in the Quran, right? There's also other concepts in the Quran which Muslims in America and abroad need to know, right? And need to understand. And they are part of our aqeedah. Mm-hmm. But before I talk about them, let me just take a step back, right? Our aqeedah, if you want to talk about the Islamic aqeedah, it can be divided into two parts, okay? We have La ilaha illallah. There is no God worthy of worship but Allah. So the first part of our declaration, when you want to enter Islam, it begins with a negation, okay? It begins with the negation. A negation of what? A negation of false idols, a negation of false idolatry, a negation of oppressive power structures. And then we affirm our belief in Allah, and then we say illallah, which is the affirmation of Allah's transcendence. So as Muslims, when we make this very statement, La ilaha illallah is a political declaration. It is a political enunciation wherein you begin by delegitimizing violent and oppressive power structures, right? And then you affirm your belief in the transcendence and in the sovereignty of Allah Azza wa Jal. And from La ilaha illallah, we have a whole array of concepts. Or let us say La ilaha, right? For example, the concept of at-takabbur, which was the first sin committed by the creation. One of the first sins created by creation, that was Iblis. And then we have at-tughyan, the concept of at-tughyan and taghut. Then we have the concept of fitna, right? So all of these kind of fit into what we mean when we say La ilaha, right? And then, of course, there's a whole set of Quranic concepts such as Hakimiyyat Allah, Ubudiyyat Allah, Tanzih, which basically affirm our belief that Allah is transcendent and so forth. So when Muslims in America come to understand the reality of La ilaha illallah as being a political, a liberating, emancipatory declaration against power structures and dominative capitalism and the militarized police states and the military industrial complex, then we have, not only do we have a role in politics in America, but we are obliged to engage in that role because it falls back onto the very first pillar of our deen through which we become Muslims, La ilaha illallah. Right?
Yeah, well, and just real quickly for some of the newer listeners, La ilaha in the Shahada, it means not necessarily just a God or deity, but also anything that is governing or superseding your faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in Allah being the lawgiver. And
yeah, it's anything that would have authority or anything that would have sovereignty, anything, deity, sovereignty, worship, anything that would be, it's encompassing of many things. But ilah is kind of hard to translate to English, but so you're negating everything that would be reserved for, that could possibly overtake Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in legislation or in anything. Right, whether that means a state or if that means
something trivial, even inside, even the way how the mechanics of your mind function and how you create thought and what you give importance to. For example, you choosing, and I'm just being nitpicky here, you choosing something like entertainment over salah. That there is a violation of that happening at the core level. And I don't think anyone could disagree with that. Now, I'm not saying you've left Islam or you've violated the article of faith to that extent, but in a minor way, we all haven't completely ingested every facet of these articles that come along with La ilaha illallah. So.
Yeah, I would think that those are, like, we divide the categories of the minor shirk and the major shirk, but I think in general, I think what most people need to understand, take away from this, is that when you say La ilaha, like he mentioned, there's a negation, and we're only, and we negate all of those things which would threaten Allah's rububiyyah, which would be, I don't want to use the term threaten, but that would be comparable to his rububiyyah. and then we only affirm his rububiyyah. Like on the counter, on the flip, when we say illallah, we're saying except for him, except for Allah, the one that contains that. But so Sim explained a little bit more, and I want to talk about this a little bit with you. Maybe you can comment on this. We hear these terms even right now, like rububiyyah, ubudiyya. We hear about these terms, taghut. Is aqidah really a science that is defined by all these terminologies? Is it really that complicated for someone, or because and this goes back to something you mentioned early on. You mentioned the different groups between the Ash'ara and the Atharis and the Maturidis. Is or should aqidah be something that complicated that we make an entire discipline out of it, especially in terms of when we're talking about something that's, we're talking about liberation and movements and ideas that people can get by. And generally what we see is that generally liberation movements and ideas that are liberating tend to not be so complex. They're pretty much very simple at the core in most, right? You don't need to, most people don't need to define what they're fighting for in 10 pages or 30 pages or have a whole a 2-year course on it to know that it's something that should be implemented, right? So from that angle, how do we approach that? Is it something, do we look at it like it's an entirely separate discipline, or what's the approach?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And inshallah ta'ala, in part of my 8-week course, I will engage in a critique of ilm al-kalam, precisely on the grounds that you had mentioned, the issue of it being too complex and it being a discipline and whatnot. But briefly put, when we talk about aqidah, we have to differentiate between two things. Between ilm al-aqidah, the science of aqidah, and between aqidah itself. In the same way we distinguish between politics and political science. So politics is something that you do, right? Political science is basically a body of knowledge and methods and research and conclusions about those actions, about political actions. So political science is something that you would read in the books. Politics is something that you would do in the public, in public affairs and whatnot. So same thing with the aqidah. What's happened is that we've conflated the science of the aqidah, right, ilm al-kalam, that we've inherited from, a very fractious history, very fractious Muslim history. The Mu'tazila, the Ash'ari, the Maturidiyya, so forth. We've inherited that to be essentially not just a science, but what aqidah is. So aqidah became limited, unfortunately, it became limited to, the covers of a small method, covers of a small book. If you want to learn aqidah, if you want to do aqidah, then review Jawhar al-Tawheed or read al-Aqidah al-Tahawiyya. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with studying the history of aqidah or the science of aqidah. But aqidah, as revealed by Allah Azza wa Jal, aqidah is revealed in order to provide man with a lens through which he can see and understand, mediate and engage and transform the world. It is a way in which we make sense of the world. It is a way in which we engage with different elements and relate them to a broader whole, right? That's the definition of metaphysics, which is what aqidah is. So aqidah is not, it does not fall within the exclusive purview of the mutakallimin and our scholars, like our Yale scholars and our Azhari scholars. No, that's something different. That's a specialization, which, by the way, is becoming more and more and more obsolete, right? Because today, if we want to talk about the science of aqidah, well, okay, let's discuss naturalism, let's discuss neo-Marxism, let's discuss intersectional feminism, let's discuss Rawlsian neoliberalism. Anyways, but aqidah is not exclusively in their purview. It is not their possession. Our access to aqidah is not mediated by scholars. This was a problem with the Christian church, that their faith, the only way they could understand their faith was through an establishment, the church establishment, which essentially became a form of hegemony, right? And Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, recognized this at one point. He was critical of this, that why have you made the aqidah into a science that is inaccessible to man? Why have you made, for example, the proof of Allah's existence so convoluted that one has to first understand Aristotelian metaphysics and logic or Platonic forms in order to prove that Allah exists? And why have you, O mutakallimin, set yourselves up as the guardians and bastions of the Islamic Aqidah? The Islamic Aqidah is something that it is something that is accessible to any Muslim, right? It is a basic, fundamental set of concepts that mediate the way that you see the world. So again, to go back to the main point, that we have to differentiate between Aqidah as a way of seeing the world, a dynamic way of seeing the world, and Aqidah as a science, which is becoming, in my opinion, very obsolete.
Right. So I guess you kind of talk about that, but the reason why I brought that up is because me and Sim have been moving through, just growing up in America and being around different groups. Whenever we talk about Aqidah, it always that conversation gets convoluted with all the different arguments and groups, and it comes to a point where, I've come to a point in my life where I realize that for me, explaining Aqidah shouldn't take more than 30 minutes to somebody. Meaning, it's all about La ilaha illallah. All right? Understanding that, and I think that sometimes we overcomplicate what the Quran made so simple.
Yes.
In many ways, right? This is something which Allah revealed to Bedouins that didn't really delve into kalam, and they didn't have any idea about philosophies that were around, or different worldviews, or postmodernism wasn't around then. It was something simple that one could get behind and understand and then process. And what I'm getting from this is that from that perspective, and you mentioned it's a lens, this is something active and it's not passive, meaning that we use this in our life daily. It's not something we just learn and then put it on the back of our mind and then just say, okay, we learned it and that's it, right? It's something that's active in our minds, when we're in our actions, when we're deciding to do something, not to do something, when we're making choices about marriage, about work, about anything.
Exactly.
Do you think the idea or the topic of Aqidah has been convoluted by academics? And I know you're from academia, but people of the past who may have made it some kind of intellectual gymnastics, maybe a way to measure people's intelligence against each other. People have all kinds of different measurements and metrics to determine who's the good students and the bad students, and other filtration processes. Do you think, is that why maybe such a simple topic like Aqidah kind of got mixed up, or do you think there's more to it than that?
Any attempt to co-opt Aqidah into an institutional space will end up basically eviscerating or removing from it its emancipatory potential, its practicality, right? Because that's the very nature of academia, right? Where it turns concepts or objects into subjects and then dissects them, and then so I think, the current discourse around Aqidah in academia has been more harmful than it has been helpful. That's not the case for everybody, right? There has been some good work coming out of academia with relation to Aqidah. One of my favorite books is Ahmad Dawood Oglu's actually I have it here. Ahmad Dawood Oglu's Alternative Paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
And so this was an academic text, basically talking about the relationship between Aqidah and our political and social imaginations and whatnot. And there's brothers like Ovamir Anjam and Abdurrahman Mustafa. So there are brothers who are, they're contributing within the academic space to a clearer understanding of the Islamic Aqidah. But generally speaking, the Islamic Aqidah as like the brother saying, as a mode of life, belongs in the practical spheres of life. Aqidah as a science, or the history of the Aqidah, yes, that is something that we can, relinquish to the academic space, and they can do what they want to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying the implementation or the praxis of the Aqidah would be, at least in the context you're speaking about related to your paper and your lecture series, would be the implementation of Islamic governance and things like that, of that nature.
Of course, of course. Now, so this kind of brings us into another topic, which is what is the political vision of the Ummah, right? And so what does it mean to engage in Islamic politics in America versus abroad? From the onset, this would be very clear that when we speak about Islamic politics, we are not talking about establishing some form of Islamic governance in the United States, right? When we talk about politics, Islamic politics, we are talking about a global vision, because remember that the obligation of politics was endowed to the Ummah and not just to a group of individuals. So when we speak of politics, collective politics, we are speaking of a global vision. We are speaking of a global movement. And when we speak of, an Islamic state, which is part of Islamic politics, part of the vision, then this obviously has to come from a Muslim land wherein we have the capacities and the intellectual environment necessary in order to welcome such a state or to establish such a project.
Mm-hmm.
But Islamic politics, as in the sense of activism, in the sense of resisting oppression, resisting violence, resisting racism, right? This is something that we are obligated to do everywhere, anywhere we see it, including the United States.
So how are you? Let's just take the current political climate.
I was just going to do that.
Yeah,
I was going to say.
So
Wait, I have a question. So here's the thing. So today, right now, you've got BLM out there, and they're saying, you know what, Black Lives Matter, and some people coming back saying all lives matter. I don't want to get in the whole discussion of that, but at the very core of it, they are upset that minority people, and Black Americans have been mistreated in America, and so now, given the definitions or the understanding you're coming from, there are Muslims today that also empathize with this segment of the population that endures hardship and is being treated misfairly. And let's go a step further. Let's say they look at it beyond race. Let's say they see this as an abuse of power, a case of abuse of power by authority, and they want to get involved with activism. And so, given what you just mentioned and the outline that you talked about, how does a youth today be involved with this, and what does that conversation look like? Meaning, where does he come from? How does he justify being part of a movement like this, and while still retaining the the core, which in terms of Aqidah and the Islamic ideas of liberation, how does he maintain that while still working with these various groups, that whatever they may be right now on the ground?
Excellent. So it falls back on one thing, right? In order for us to be able to engage in autonomous action, we need an autonomous vision. We need autonomy in terms of our vision.
Mm-hmm.
And to have autonomy in terms of our vision, we need our own foundations. So most of these groups have a certain set of foundations. For example, with the right, with the conservative right, they have this Judeo-Christian foundation, the ideas of the Republic and so forth. Mm-hmm. With the Black Lives Matter movement, it's somewhat more complicated because it's a very diverse group and whatnot. But Muslims in America, the problem is that we still have not articulated our vision for Islam in America or Muslims in the world, right? So it's difficult for us to be able to act because we don't have the autonomy. And that's, again, why we constantly are being absorbed into these groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you an example. With the Black Lives Matter protest, okay? Now, as a Muslim, right, who is obligated to stand up in the face of oppression, mm-hmm. and racism and murder, and to stand up against the despotic militarized police establishments and whatnot, as a Muslim, I am obligated to partake in the protests and in the events that are taking place right now. Then the question becomes, okay, so then what's my relationship with Black Lives Matter? Well, we have a common interest, right, to end systemic violence.
Mm-hmm.
But then what happens when I become part of that movement and I come and I recognize that movement also supports Black transgender rights and opening queer spaces, and all of these, all of these things which are completely antithetical and unorthodox to our tradition, right? And Muslims keep falling into this problem, right? They're constantly being absorbed. And another example of that is, I mean, with all due respect to our Muslim figures, our Muslim leaders in the United States, but this helps explain some of the ambivalence and the confusion in the positions that have been taken up by people like Sheikh Omar Sulaiman, may Allah reward him and preserve him.
Amen.
And also rectify his mistakes. Linda Sarsour, for example, Yasser Qadi, and so forth. There's always this ambivalence, right? Because we have the obligation to partake in the struggle against oppression, but because we don't have our own autonomy in terms of vision, foundations, and structure, we end up being absorbed by these.
So you're almost forced to accept their positions, because if you're working under their umbrella, it's not partly, you have to work entirely under their umbrella. So naturally that means absorbing all of their arguments and all of their causes as well, which would maybe include LGBTQ, transgender, abortion, drug use. I mean, legalization of drugs. And I guess, so I totally get where you're coming from, because one thing that I've talked about on this show a lot is I understand why Muslims as a group of people feel like they may have allies on the left, and why they may feel alienated from the right, even though in a lot of ways at the core, meaning what I mean is core, I mean by moral values, the right is probably closer to the way we view society in terms of abortion and drug use and marriage and things like that. Like in that regards, we're probably closer to them, but they don't find they find animosity from the right, so they tend to move to the left, and they look at it as an action of self-preservance, meaning that we're going to preserve our position in America. But what I fear the most is that it will come back to bite us, because right now the left is being inclusive, and they're unifying everybody against things they don't like on the right, whether that be because right now the right, the Christian right, has the loudest voice right now for the right. Like they're opposing gay marriage, legalization of drugs, transgender issues. But what happens when they get what they want and they come back to the Muslims and say, well, the Quran has very harsh language towards the gay people, or towards women's rights, or towards these things. And you know what? You should now change that, or at least reform it. And if we say no, we're cool, we don't want you to believe, even if you say we don't want you to believe that this is for us, they can then turn around and say, well, look, this sheikh or this muhajjaba used to be with us, marching with us before, and they're real Muslims, right? They're practicing, so maybe you're the extreme one, and maybe we have to maybe you guys are quote unquote terrorists or radicals. And so now so effectively what happens is orthodoxy becomes radicalism. It becomes ostracized, and you almost become ashamed to be a part of it, because they shame you into thinking that it's something backward. And I feel like that, and to sum it up, I feel like aligning with the left may seem like we get by in this world, but it will definitely kill our akhirah. Like kids are now, I don't know if you're on Twitter or anything, but you can go to like Muslim Twitter and find the younger generation. A lot of them have like LGBTQ flags next to their names, and like pro LGBTQ, pro this, pro that.
And pronouns too.
Yeah, pronouns. And the thing is that the funny thing is they're becoming that way because it's synonymous with Black Lives Matter. Like the platform they engage with in order to do good, because they genuinely felt that minorities were being oppressed. When they signed up for that, it then also meant they had to sign up for this as well too. It was a package deal. And I feel like that's so dangerous for us that we don't realize 20 years from now, we're going to look back and be like, we saw this happening. Like we saw it in front of our eyes and we just let it happen.
You know, I was thinking about Black Lives Matter. What do you think about that? See, here's the problem is the phrase Black Lives Matter. You know, a lot of people are perfectly fine with it, but then you hear about at least from a Muslim perspective, you see all these associations with, various intersections of American society that might be contradictory to our faith. Then you say, well, the BLM organization, I don't necessarily want to affiliate with, and I'm not going to write hashtag Black Lives Matter because it might be misconstrued with co-signing with the values that organization upholds. But you're not necessarily against Black Lives Matter, just the word and the literal meaning. So I was kind of worried. I was wondering, does a statement like that transcend the ideological backdrop, the ideologues, and what they were behind? Do sometimes statements or slogans transcend what the ideologues intended? Well, what's your opinion on that?
That's a very good question, and it's a moral question. Okay, it's a moral question, and it's also a strategic question, right? Now, from a moral perspective, okay, again, I said we have this problematic that the Black Lives Matter slogan, as a slogan, means literally that Black lives should no longer be susceptible and vulnerable to excessive police violence. That's what it means as a slogan. As an organization, of course, it means something else, right? So we have to be very strategic, right? And being strategic means not letting any movement or not letting any party appropriate a cause. Not letting for example, Black transgender elements within BLM appropriate the cause of anti-racism. Now, how do we do that as Muslims? Well, if we had our own platform and if we had our own, let's say, vision and our own network, then we could start engaging ourselves with the Black Muslims in America. There are many Black Muslims in America, very orthodox Black Muslim communities in the United States. You have parts of New York that are, you walk through some parts of Queens, you look left and right, you find sisters in niqab and brothers in thobes, and there's a very strong Black Muslim population. So it's really a twofold issue. One, developing our autonomy in terms of foundations, vision, and platform. And then strategically, as Muslims in America, engaging with the Black community, engaging with the Hispanic community, and engaging with communities, oppressed communities that have certain issues or that have certain causes and whatnot, and then making sure that this engagement is done on our own terms, right, on our own grounds, and not allowing these concepts and these ideas and these causes, such as the sacredness of Black blood, for example. We should not let this be appropriated by people who also have other agendas, like the transgender LGBTQ agenda. And what's interesting about, I say especially the LGBTQ movement, right? Because, ironically, paradoxically, these are the most intolerant, exclusionary, fascist toned individuals that you can engage with. There is absolutely no way to build a bridge with them. Okay, as a Muslim in America, I've engaged with the conservative right, debates, and I've spoken, and there's been discussions and whatnot. But when it comes to issues of transgender and pronouns, it's a mess. It's just a mess.
Yeah.
I think part of that problem is that that there's no room for argument for them. Like, it's all or nothing for them. Like,
just look at, I'll give you an example, okay? Look at the recent controversy with J.K. Rowling.
Yeah.
Okay? So J.K. Rowling has devoted 20 years of her life to feminism and to actually promoting transgender rights. So she doesn't believe in it, but she spent 20 years respecting their cause, right? And she was very inclusive. And then just because she comes out with a post saying sex is real, right? That men can't menstruate. Suddenly she's receiving death threats. Magazines are withdrawing her name, withdrawing her whatever connections with that person, with J.K. Rowling and stuff like that. So it's a very intolerant environment. So I don't see how we can even engage with that community until they are able to open channels for dialogue and open channels for debate and for discussion. At which point, as Muslims, we would have no problem in engaging with them and debating these issues. And even in Beirut, I had prepared, a dialogue, very thorough study from a biological, physiological, philosophical, moral perspective on transgender rights. And then when we approach them and we say, okay, let's discuss this, let's quell the anger that's on campus, and let's kind of like put it on the table so that there is a fruitful discussion. And they refused, right? And so I can only imagine what would happen if I suggested something like that in America. Right?
Well, usually these ideologues are from the critical theorists from each of these intersections. For example, with whether it's racism, that's the critical race theorists. They come up with the most absurd types of, ways to compare and contrast to how racism is being affected in your mind and how you apply it in your lives. And then in the LGBT, there's the queer theory theorists who are also propagating these ideas, and they not only are damaging or showing their intolerance in their own movements, but they're on the surface level that, I mean, for someone who's intelligent, they can see that, hey, this is someone who's an ideologue who has some motive or some something they're trying to push, but their idea sometimes gets superimposed on the other minority as well. Like for example, some of the ridiculous things related to racism. For example, what was some of the stuff that we saw during the riots? All cops are bastards. ACAB, they're putting that out. And
well, there's a huge thing about CRT as well too, about how only certain people can be racist, not other people can be racist, right? I mean, there's a lot of movements here. It's about the rich are all to blame because the rich are the ones who have all the money and power. They want to keep everybody else poor. Capitalism.
I saw a CRT person on Fox News come on and tell the people on Fox News that math is racist because they're using math to change how colonials or colonization impacted black people. Well, and so how is math being racist?
Well, they argue that it's they have different learning styles. Like African Americans learn different.
That's different. That's a different. He's specifically asking her. I wish I could pull this.
Oh, okay.
Or the thing up. He's asking, why is math racist though? We're talking about 1 + 1 = 2. Why is this math racist?
So I think what's happening here is that, I mean, this is how I envision this. Like, and I wanted to come back to this, that there's this huge cancel culture right now, right? Like anything you do, if you don't, move with the grain, if you go against the grain, they're going to cancel you. Everything you've done, I mean, meaning, and I think we as Muslims are totally opposed to that, because if someone makes one mistake, we don't disregard everything they've done or any accomplishments they have or any benefit they may have come from them, right? Or that may have come from them. We don't just simply disregard it, right? We understand that people are human beings and can make mistakes, or maybe they have opinions that are not exactly aligning with yours, but it doesn't mean that now they have become, we don't take such radical stances against people, right? And I think this cancel culture is largely effective because we're dependent on their movement. Like, we don't have our own autonomous movement, so therefore being dependent on them, we're afraid of being canceled by them, right? If that makes sense. So it's kind of like this grip on power, this manipulation of you. If you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to cancel you. We're going to label you a bigot, a fascist. We're going to label you.
We're going to dox you.
Yeah, dox you. We're going to put your information out there. We're going to get you fired from your work. I mean, it's almost like it's bullying, right? And it's funny thing is, because a lot of these groups come out and say, "Oh, don't bully the transgender. Don't bully the gay people." I'm good with that. Don't bully them. But then why are you bullying people who have a different opinion than you?
Ali, this is a good segue to something I want to discuss with you. the nature of activism has even become, in terms of how, as Muslims, how our Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam had engaged with the power structures at his time. We see a different form of activism today. And that activism is, if I could be very reductive about it, it's very lazy.
It's a part-time thing.
It's a part-time. You sit in
It's a
your
hashtag on Twitter.
You lazily study a subject, and then you go on onto Twitter or whatever social media platform, and you scream and shout. You don't, and even the ideologues, some CRTs out of Australia, I don't want to mention their name, but I got into it with them recently. But they'll write a book or something about something related to oppression or why Muslims are being oppressed or something related to our oppression. They get some kind of spotlight and being invited to some lectures and things like that, where everyone pats each other on the shoulder. They're there. It'll be okay. One day the Muslims will make it. But this is what activism, it seems like it's been reduced to. I mean, you see how the Prophet and his Sahaba, let's just put that aside for a second. Revolutionaries for thousands of years, from millennia, there was always a leader who just took charge and said, "Hey, everyone, get behind me. We're charging. You get behind me. I know the path forward, and we're all going to jump on my boat, and we're going to go to the new world, and we're going to conquer all the Red Indians," or whatever they used to call them back then, But this is what their mentality was: revolutionary people who wanted change. They had people who bought into them. What do you think about it? How isn't it so much different now than it was?
100%. I think so. First and foremost, when we talk about activism, we have an archetype that we go back to, and that's the prophetic method. So the prophetic method lays out the main contours for what it means to be a Muslim activist. And the first of which is withdrawal, in struggle against any oppressive establishment or power structure. The taghut, ijtinab al-taghut, to withdraw and to keep distance from any taghuti apparatus or political apparatus. So that's the first thing. So a strategy of non-cooperation and withdrawal from these institutions. In Lebanon, in America, that would be the broader political establishment, and this would include the militarized police institutions and law enforcement and CVE and whatnot. Another prophetic imperative, that's embedded in the archetype of the Prophet's method is upholding communal affairs, right? Tabanni al-masalih, upholding the affairs of the community, like the Prophet ﷺ did in Mecca, right? And then the third thing was creating awareness, right? Generating, correcting the concepts of the people, enlightening the minds of the people, liberating their psyches, their individual and collective psyche, allowing them to see the world as it is, So those are the main foundations, the pillars of Islamic activism. Now, with regards to on the ground, I think this is where the question of strategy comes in. The problem is that we have a lot of Muslim ideologues and thinkers, but we don't have a lot of Muslim strategists. And when you bring together an idea, like an ideologue and a strategist, you have a very dangerous mix, right? A very powerful mix, because that's what affects change. When you take something like the prophetic archetype, the prophetic method for activism, and then you give it a concrete strategy, right, based on trial and error and based on things that work, based on understanding the dynamics of the street, understanding mass psychology, understanding media, understanding print, understanding social media, understanding how to certain politicians and so forth, how to mobilize, how to apply pressure in certain places. I think that's when you go from a platform to an operative movement on the ground. So Allahu alam, what I see for Muslims in America, and this is something I would love to work towards, is one, setting up that platform, right, which is our principles and our aqidah and the prophetic method, and then augmenting that with a strategy and strategist, basically.
Yeah, and it just
beyond social media. I mean, that's not an option, really.
Yeah, and what I was talking about earlier with regards to like a leader, a strong leader where people can get behind, it's become actually a tool of the power structures where they're utilizing that tactic where, Trump just simply says, I know the way forward. Everyone come behind me. It doesn't make sense right now, but and he speaks in such simple terms, and that's why he won that election. Putin, other despots all across the world, they're just, as long as they're sure, their people are sure. And they're just like, okay, well, it's kind of taking the sails away from the activist community, the one that counterbalances or counteracts as against the various power structures that these people are essentially people are without teeth. They have some influence without, in certain elements of industries like entertainment and things like that. But when it comes down to it, you look at the ideologues, there's not really much behind that.
Yeah.
Those sales.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I'm gathering from this is that if Muslims really want to make an effective change and be activists under the Islamic umbrella, they need to organize themselves, and there needs to be a grassroots movements among Muslims, exclusively for Muslims by Muslims, and from that point, it can be the rallying base, and you can then decide what causes are important to support, what causes, and we can identify the core issues and say this is what we will support. Why? Because it's based on Islamic principles. It's based on the principles of justice and equality and fairness, and we will change. And here's the other thing I don't think I've really talked about, but Islam does not only challenge the injustices, but it provides a solution and the alternative for it. And that's one thing that many other groups don't provide. They just want to protest the injustice, but they cannot come with a solution. And that's one way in which Islam is unique to these groups. Like, many people are upset that there's power struggles or abuse of power or police brutality or racism or extreme forms of capitalism. They're upset about it because people are being hurt by it. But unfortunately, they don't have the means or the knowledge or something which is better as an alternative to it, while we Muslims can present that because we have an alternative. And that should be our strength in having a unique group, an autonomous group, away from them saying we can work to address the same cause, but we believe we are more suitable or more fitting to address this because we have solutions. We have proven solutions.
Yeah, and I remember after the activists, that all the protests that happened a couple of weeks ago, we did a couple shows on relating to how capitalism is different from Islam in how it exploits the worst attributes in humanity. So I kind of gave a compare and contrast of how Islamic our framework is not utilizing the most convenient way to get our objectives accomplished. I explained how in capitalist societies, there is no moral framework preventing people from being racist to one another. So some of our listeners were upset by that. They're like, you're taking away from the black experience and you're making it ideological and you're talking about this and that. I'm like, first of all, if I talked about it, then you wouldn't, or if we brought on a black person, it wouldn't be the right black person. Or if it wasn't this, it would be something else. And I just talked about what I know in terms of ideologies. And people were upset that no, I'm not even talking about a lot. Just a couple people were upset, sent me emails about, oh, you should let, African Americans or black people talk about this issues. I'm not even talking about the black experience. I'm talking about racism. Racism happens to everyone, and it's not just exclusively to black people, but we're talking about why racism is being incorporated into certain power structures in America, and how
it's been used.
Not just racism, but the worst qualities of humanity are being exploited and abused because there are there's no preventative measures within the capitalist framework to prevent this. They have ethics and things like that. They say, oh, well, we have laws and then we have the ethics that are supposed to prevent this type of things, but they don't really prevent anything, do they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that goes back to my point that that would be the benefit of having an autonomous group, is that we are able to provide, not only speak out against it, but then provide an alternative to it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Ali, did you have any closing thoughts, any ideas, or anything that we didn't cover? I know there was a lot that we may have skipped over, but
just to wrap up, I guess just to wrap up everything where we just said, the only way forward in terms of having a vision and being able to address the issues in America that you have brought up, such as racism, LGBTQ, capitalism, and so forth. The only way we can address those things is, as the brother said, that we need autonomy. And to have autonomy, we need an autonomous platform. But most importantly, in order for us to have an autonomous platform, we need an autonomous foundation, and that is the Islamic Aqidah. And Islamic, we don't say a return to the Islamic Aqidah, not just because we are Muslim and that's our Aqidah, but because the Islamic Aqidah uniquely, unlike other worldviews, unlike other metaphysics, is in and of itself an emancipatory, liberating Aqidah, right? That not only can serve as our foundations, but generate political, emancipatory politics, and flesh out and give us a far broad-reaching horizon for politics in America. Not just politics in America, but politics globally speaking. All of these issues which we discussed, inshallah ta'ala, I will be addressing them on Sunday at my New Medina page on Facebook. So it's called the Foundations Halaqa. So inshallah, I have a lecture entitled Dissent and Politics in the Meccan Quran. And then after that, there will be an 8-week course on basically everything from metaphysics and aqidah to Islam to politics to vision and strategy. So over a period of 8 weeks, inshallah ta'ala. So be sure to check that out, to get more information on some of the ideas that we've been discussing in this session.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure we include the links below in the comment section or in the episode description, rather. Jazakallah khair, Ali, for coming. Mort, thank you for coming from Buffalo, New York, where hopefully we can get in a few more episodes before you leave.
Yeah, I'll be here for some time because we're on quarantine and working from home, and so alhamdulillah, we got time to kill.
And Ali, I know you're gonna be swinging by Chicago later on in a few weeks. Hopefully, inshallah, we'll bring you back on in studio. We'd love to have you as a guest and hopefully break some bread with you. Jazakallah khair, everyone. Help us out on patreon.com/the Mad Mamluks. Make sure you click on like, subscribe, and throw some comments in the comment section below. Just talk about my good looks, or Ali's rather. MashaAllah. We are back next week again. Yeah, we might have another episode this week, but we'll see y'all later.
Let's try to pump out a roundtable later on.
Yeah. Maybe in a couple days, inshallah. All right.
Yeah.
We'll see y'all later. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.